So hello, this is Kyle Matthews, Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. Very pleased today for our second interview on the Coronavirus Diaries, Human Rights in the Age of the Global Pandemic, to have on our show Marcus Kolga. Marcus is a well-known commentator following authoritarianism, digital disinformation campaigns. Marcus is also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So Marcus, thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
So Marcus, I'd like to start off with, you wrote a very interesting piece for Maclean's magazine on the whole notion that we must not forget to hold the Chinese government to account for what is the global pandemic is seeing a shutdown of economies, a breakdown of human rights, people's ability to sustain their families, their livelihoods. I'm wondering if you could just maybe tell us, going back into that, like why is this issue important?
Well, that piece that I wrote, which really does, it questions China's responsibility in this entire pandemic. It came up in a Facebook discussion. This was a few weeks ago. I just posted a very casual question. When can we start talking about the consequences and the responsibility for this pandemic? And clearly, China has some sort of responsibility for this. They knew of the outbreak in Wuhan already back in November, and it took them nearly 2 months to really react. And the information that's coming out, or the disinformation that's coming out of China right now, is that the Western world really should be lauding China for its efforts to contain the virus, but it did nothing of the sort because it dragged its feet. You can't hold China responsible for the creation of this virus. This is a natural recurring event, but the fact that they were unable to contain it, they used disinformation to obfuscate what was actually going on. And because of their negligence in this entire process in November and December, we're here where we are right now with the pandemic. So the question is, do we hold them responsible? Is there some way to do that? And should we start thinking about that now? Because the toll of this pandemic, I think when we're 6 months from now, we won't have seen anything like this economically or physically.
I agree with you. I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg. And it's interesting that you've talked, maybe you can talk a bit about how you see China responding now, how it's trying to create a new narrative around this. Like you said, that it's trying to see or showcase itself as the savior of helping Italy and others. But at the same time, the negligence resulted in us being forced to lock up in our homes and not be able to work. I'm wondering, what have you seen since you wrote your op-ed on the kind of disinformation tactics that we're seeing coming from Beijing?
Well, quite frankly, it's mind-blowing. I've never seen anything like this as far as the volume of disinformation that is being thrown at us from not just China, but Russia, Iran, other regimes as well. And the narrative, it's a classic totalitarian tactic, is to deny and deflect. And so some of the narratives that we're seeing, and we're seeing these promoted by Chinese diplomats, Chinese media, is that this virus, it didn't originate in Wuhan, but rather that it's a weapon, a U.S. biological weapon, that it was developed in the U.S. and somehow transported to Wuhan and released there. We've also seen various narratives that the virus was produced in Canada and inadvertently sent to Wuhan. So they're basically trying to throw out any sort of narrative that enables them to avoid any responsibility for this outbreak, any responsibility whatsoever. And so they range from these crazy narratives to beyond.
No, I've been seeing this take place on Twitter. The spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry has been retweeting, as you said in your article, this conspiracy website, Global Research, which is based in Montreal. I've seen him also tweet to random Americans who are kind of conspiracy theorists. Nothing that is scientific or academically proven, and it's been quite incredible to me. And I imagine there's also a lot of fear in Beijing about what, in the long run, as we see an economic collapse, people lose their loved ones. That I can imagine that the the ruling party in China must be also a little fearful about what this means for their relationships with the outside world, economic security. I mean, it really is something to that I'm thinking about what's going to happen in the long term.
Sure. Well, I'm sure they're quite afraid of any sort of being having to be responsible for any of this or taking any responsibility for it. One of the things that I've been seeing and what I've read, Josh Rogan in the Washington Post just last week wrote that there are Chinese officials who publicly come out and have stated that they should be using the pandemic to China's advantage, and so taking economic advantage of the chaos that's happening right now. And so, the disinformation that we're seeing, I think it's very much connected with this cynical sort of objective now. And so, they're not just afraid of taking responsibility, but they're going on the offensive with this. And that, I think, Western governments should be aware of. So when we're seeing supplies sent to places like Serbia, when we're seeing them sent to Italy, this is the Chinese government taking, perhaps they're helping to a certain degree, but it's really the Chinese government taking advantage of the situation and ingratiating themselves to these various governments. And it's very much a PR ploy on their part.
And they see it as a form of soft power, right? So China's helping.
Sure.
With a lot of, we've seen with some of the Chinese propaganda or disinformation, they always want to have no negative comments or feelings or emotions about China, but just positive ones. And so they're trying to construe that. Maybe could you tell us a bit about, because you've also done a lot of work on Russia and Russian disinformation, how is the Russian approach, or what we're seeing or what you're reading, how is it different from China? So do they have different objectives, different purposes?
Well, I think the Russian approach is the classic Soviet approach. It's, again, the objective is to sow as much confusion as possible, throw out as many conspiracy theories as possible, use the existing platforms that are out there to do this. And I think, quite frankly, the Chinese have learned from the Russians about how to do this. From all my research, it seems that this conspiracy theory that the virus is coming from the US or Canada, these were placed onto Russian language conspiracy theory websites controlled by the Russian state already in early January. And it was from there that the Chinese propagandists took their disinformation stories and spread them out. So the Russians jumped on this quite quickly. I think they saw the opportunity to destabilize the Western world, because that's what Russia's objective and the Soviet objective was back in the Cold War, was to use disinformation to sow confusion in order to destabilize us. And so we're seeing a continuation of this. And the European Union, in fact, just last week, warned of the fact that Russian disinformation, not just high-level disinformation about the origins of the virus, but specifically spreading information that could intensify the impact of coronavirus in the West. And so this is not something that, Russophobes or those that are just critical of the Putin regime are saying, but the European Union itself is warning that the Russians are doing this. And so it's very easy for China to amplify those narratives. And what we're seeing now, I've seen over the past couple of days, is that Iran has jumped on board. And the Iranian regime is also amplifying these narratives. Their narratives, of course, are suited to their own objectives, and that's the fact that they're trying to sow stories that Israel is somehow responsible for the pandemic, and that Israel is trying to intensify the problem. So Russia is very much central to all of this, and it's quite frankly it's mind blowing if you go to a site like Russia Insider or Global Research, as we were just talking about earlier, to just look at the number of these crazy narratives that they're pushing to the Western world, not to the Western world, but to the English speaking world and beyond. So yeah, this is a big issue for Russia, and they're trying to take advantage of it.
So when you talk about, some have argued that the disinformation we're seeing right now around the coronavirus could actually be deadly.
Yeah.
The Russian, some of the propaganda that's being put out there, or disinformation, it's aimed to sow division between everyday citizens. They don't know how to respond. But part of it is also could put people's lives in danger by giving them wrong information and
Yeah.
making them think that that there's a conspiracy behind this. It truly is, I think, a very frightening time. And I know some of the social media giants have been trying to get on top of this. Twitter launched, they found disinformation campaigns coming of Russian state actors, but it really seems right now that we're in an era of it's hard to believe anything and believe everything at the same time.
Well, and that's exactly the message that Russia Today and other Russian media is trying to put out there. There's a headline that I read, I think it was just yesterday, on RT. So RT is, of course, the state-owned and state-operated television and media, online media platform for the Russian state, along with Sputnik. And one of the headlines was, "How are we trusting experts too much with regards to COVID-19?" And so they were promoting people to doubt what experts are saying, and that could cause problems. We don't know if Russian or Chinese or Iranian propagandists are behind some of these narratives that are promoting natural remedies for COVID. The European Union has warned and has suggested that they could be pushing these, but these are extremely dangerous, and I'm sure you've seen them. I was seeing them over the weekend on Facebook. I had friends who are, one of whom is a medical professional, in fact, sent me a link to an audio file from, I think it was a Spanish woman claiming to be a worker at a hospital in the Canary Islands. The audio file suggested that by drinking soup, tea, and gargling with vinegar, one could kill the virus if you had it. So to do this regularly, you could build immunity. And when I replied to this friend of mine, he said, "Well, what's so dangerous about that?" And it's remarkable that people don't realize that the false sense of immunity to this virus, that these otherwise seemingly harmless health tips might be giving, it's putting people at risk if they truly believe that, having a hot bowl of soup will give them some sort of immunity, right? And it puts others at risk. So if you're walking around drinking soup, thinking, I'm beating this thing, you could be spreading it to your family, to your friends, when you're going to the grocery store. So stuff is really, really dangerous, even though it may not seem so on the surface.
No, it's funny you mentioned that, because I received 2 audio files sent by friends on Facebook with that same person saying, at first, if you get coronavirus, it gathers in your throat. If you have warm water, it will make it fall into your stomach, and your stomach acids will get rid of it. And I just asked myself, I said, why are these strangers saying this to me? I'm still keeping the social distancing up, but you're right. It gives people a false sense, and they might feel that, hey, as long as I'm having my tea and coffee in the morning, I can still go out and have a normal life. Might contract it, and everyone else will get sick. And I guess that's the really, I guess, the human rights element of this disinformation and the coronavirus, where we're seeing people push information that could have an impact on your physical safety. To me, that's the highlight of a human rights is not being murdered or living in safety. So it's extremely troubling. I'm wondering, what do you think is the responsibilities then of dealing with this? What can Canada do? Does the private sector have a role in fighting this disinformation? What would you recommend that can or should be done?
Well, as you may know, I've been calling for the Canadian government to deploy some sort of, whether it's some sort of task force that looks at disinformation, monitors it, and exposes it to the Canadian public already for a number of years now. We've seen the European Union doing this. They have the Eastern Stratcom that was put in place around 2014, 2015. And they have a great website that I recommend everyone go and look at. It's EU versus Disinfo. And they've done a great job of constantly posting information about disinformation tactics and campaigns that are out there targeting Europeans. We, quite shockingly, don't have anything like that. We did try to address disinformation before the election. My concern is, and it seems that the government only saw disinformation as an election problem, but it's not. And now we're seeing the problem rise again obviously with COVID-19. And the government doesn't seem to be reacting to this. Of course, we need ventilators, we need masks, and we need to make sure that people are engaging in social distancing. But this disinformation, I mean, you and I both have we both received that audio file. How many of our friends actually listened to that and believed it? The Canadian government needs to be taking this very seriously, because this sort of disinformation could cost lives. And the government needs to be working with media, other organizations, to expose this and debunk it on an ongoing basis. Whenever we see these disinformation efforts, we should have a place, in the government should have a place where we can report them. Anyone can report them. And whether it's Health Canada or any sort of website that they build, they need to be exposing these efforts and making sure that there's a place where Canadians can go and learn about disinformation, so that they're not fooled by these efforts. Because this is only the start. Like you said, it's the tip of the iceberg. And these regimes will try to use these same sorts of tactics, and they'll only intensify as we go forward over the next weeks and months.
I saw a think tank expert in London about a month ago say that there's a unspoken global war right now between the major tech titans in Silicon Valley and authoritarian regimes, in which authoritarian regimes have really learned to use these social media platforms to penetrate societies, to wreak havoc. And I'm wondering, I think it's true, like we're responding, but it seems over the election, it seems we're responding in a very ad hoc manner to election interference or cyber attack or whatever, but we don't have a grand plan. And I'm wondering why that is. If it's complacency, if it's a belief that we're the good guys, we don't have any enemies. I hope that we'll have a wake up call, and these discussions might reach some of the policymakers that would think about this and start giving some resources to people outside of government that really want to work on this. I'm wondering, so you've talked about what can an individual citizen do? We talked about there's no portal to report disinformation. If you see something online, you can report a tweet. If you think it's false, report something to Facebook, or if your friend shares something, you can say, hey, that's not real, don't do that. But is that sufficient? Or do these tech companies, you think, also might be able to ramp up their efforts or work more collaboratively with individual citizens and NGOs?
Well, I think the tech companies are really bad at doing this. They haven't been doing it over the past number of years, even though governments have asked them to do it. I think they're in a panic with COVID-19 and trying to address the problem. I think they're doing an okay job. If you go and search COVID on Twitter or Facebook, immediately there's a Facebook site that comes up at the top of the search that tells you to follow a link to reliable information. So, I think they're trying. I think that Canadians themselves, when they do see this disinformation, like you and I saw over the weekend, we need to be exposing it and telling our friends to stop spreading disinformation like that. But the problem is, how does a regular Canadian, the average citizen, how do they recognize this as disinformation? That's a big problem. And I think these social media giants do have a role to play. The audio file that you and I were talking about, you mentioned earlier that these authoritarian and totalitarian regimes have become quite clever in the way that they share information. Well, that audio file, if you think about it, it's very hard to report it. You can report a post on Facebook, you can report a post on Twitter, but when someone sends you an individual audio file like that, it's very difficult to report it. So it's actually quite clever the way that that specific piece of disinformation was spread virally. And so it's, again, the tech giants and the social media companies, they need to monitor these issues and certainly empower the users to help identify and ensure that this sort of information isn't spread on their platforms.
Marcus, I might end with one last, maybe a reflection, and then ask you to give a comment, because you've already donated at least 20 minutes of your time towards this. One thing that I've been doing is when I see disinformation online, particularly on Twitter, coming from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that's claiming the U.S. Army is behind this and spreading just false info, which is not true. I've been reporting them to Twitter, and one of my additional concerns is that you have these authoritarian governments that don't allow their citizens to use or have access to Twitter, Facebook, or these tech platforms, but yet at the same time, they're allowed to use them publicly to spread misinformation. I just wonder, should the tech companies have a policy that says, if you're an authoritarian government like Iran, Russia, or China, if you don't allow your citizens to access our services, we shouldn't allow the heads of those regimes to use them for whatever purpose. I don't know if that's an idea worth pursuing or if you've thought about that, but it's something that I definitely have been thinking about in the last few weeks.
No, for sure, it's a problem. We've seen the Chinese have taken great advantage of this in spreading their U.S. Virus conspiracy theories, certainly here in Sweden and elsewhere. I would only say that, I think when we're looking at ways to address this problem, we need to make sure that we also defend the values of free speech. And I'm not a fan of censoring, and those of other known propagandists, so to speak, is instead of on Twitter there's the blue symbol, perhaps on those accounts there could be a red symbol. That
I love this. I love this.
Right, that clearly identifies them as, red is dangerous, or a yellow mark or something like that. So that when you see these individuals, whether they're diplomats, heads of states, or just propaganda organizations like RT or Sputnik, when they're tweeting, you can identify them as being such. And don't forget, with the CRTC, if we're talking about films that have violence, swearing, sex, we place labels on those to warn Canadians before they watch them. Why on earth not do that with foreign propagandists? So that Canadians know what they're seeing and before they get into it, and are reminded periodically that this is a foreign state media outlet or a propaganda platform or something like that. That's something that we could do without interfering with our values of freedom of speech.
Well, I think this is a perfect time to draw our interview to the end. You left us with a really interesting idea that can be considered by the tech companies or civil society groups to lobby for, and I think we're going to have to get more and more people together thinking about this, because it clearly it's a challenge and not everyone has an answer. So Marcus, thank you so much for taking time, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Good to talk to you, Kyle.
All the best.